I'm Olivia Jensen, 29, and the apartment I spent 5 years saving for just became the center of family drama. During our monthly dinner, my parents casually announced, "Your sister will live in your apartment," as if my hard-earned space was community property. While I nodded and sipped my wine, internally I was screaming. The look in my mother's eyes said this wasn't a suggestion, and my sister's entitled smile told me everything I needed to know. Before I dive into how this family ambush unfolded, and what I did next, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe if you've ever had family members who think your boundaries are just suggestions. Growing up as the middle child in the Jensen family meant living in the shadow of perfectionism and expectations that seemed to apply differently to each of us. Being the first one to graduate college meant something to me, but almost nothing to my parents, who viewed my education as the bare minimum rather than the achievement it was for someone who worked 3 jobs while maintaining a full scholarship. My apartment in downtown Portland wasn't just 4 walls and a ceiling with exposed brick and morning sunlight that painted the hardwood floors golden. It represented every extra shift I picked up at the campus coffee shop, every tutoring session I squeezed in between classes, and every penny I saved instead of joining friends for weekend getaways. When I signed that lease 2 years ago, I finally felt like I had something that was entirely mine. Something tangible that represented my independence from a family dynamic that had always left me gasping for air and recognition. My older sister, Rachel, had always been the golden child, the one whose artistic talents were celebrated with gallery showings funded by my parents, while my academic achievements warranted nothing more than a perfunctory, "That's nice," over dinner. Rachel moved in and out of our parents' house like it had a revolving door, always after another failed relationship or career setback that somehow wasn't her fault. She'd arrive with suitcases full of designer clothes bought with our parents' credit card, crying about how unfair life had been to her, and they would comfort her with spare keys to their vacation property or a new car to help her get back on her feet. Meanwhile, I drove the same used Honda Civic I bought in college, meticulously maintained because I knew no replacement was coming if it broke down. My younger brother Ethan was the baby of the family, perpetually excused from responsibility, because he was finding himself through a series of abandoned hobbies and half-finished online courses that my parents funded without question. The 3 of us existed in separate orbits within the family, receiving vastly different expectations and support, with me always caught in the middle, expected to be both independent and endlessly accommodating. The pattern of my parents making decisions that affected my life without consulting me wasn't new. When I was 16, they volunteered me to babysit my cousin's children every weekend for an entire summer, informing me only after they'd already made the commitment. During college, they gave my off-campus apartment address to distant relatives who needed a place to stay during a family wedding, calling me the morning of their arrival. Each time I tried to establish boundaries, I was met with accusations of selfishness and reminded of family obligations that somehow never seemed to apply to my siblings. The past year had been different, though. I'd finally found my footing in my career as an environmental consultant, earning respect and recognition that didn't depend on my family's approval. I'd started seeing a therapist who helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't selfish but necessary for my mental health. I had even successfully declined hosting Thanksgiving, breaking a tradition that had always left me exhausted and unappreciated. These small victories had made me feel like I was finally gaining control over my relationship with my family, establishing myself as an adult with choices rather than a perpetual people-pleaser. The monthly family dinners remained my concession to tradition, a controlled environment where I could maintain connection without sacrificing too much of myself. Little did I know that this particular Sunday dinner would test every boundary I had worked so hard to establish, forcing me to decide, once and for all, if I was willing to stand up for myself, even when it meant standing alone against the united front of my family's expectations. The aroma of my mother's signature pot roast filled the house as I arrived, precisely 10 minutes late, a small act of defiance I allowed myself each month. My father answered the door with his typical brisk hug and immediate commentary on Portland traffic, as if my delayed arrival was a personal affront rather than a deliberate choice. Rachel was already there, perched on the living room sofa with a glass of wine, her designer boots propped on our mother's antique coffee table, a liberty I would never have been granted. Ethan arrived 20 minutes after me, receiving only warm smiles and an affectionate, "We were about to start without you," from our mother. The beginning of dinner followed its usual script, my father dominating conversation with his opinions on politics and business, while my mother interjected with questions about everyone's week that were really setups for her to share neighborhood gossip. I was midway through a practiced, sanitized update about my work when my father cleared his throat, the universal signal in our family that the real agenda was about to begin. "Rachel has some news," he announced, as if introducing a presidential address. My sister looked up from her phone, which she had been scrolling through beneath the table, her expression shifting from boredom to practiced vulnerability. "Jason and I broke up," she said, naming her boyfriend of 8 months whom I had met exactly once at a family barbecue where he spent most of the time talking about his cryptocurrency investments. "He's being totally unreasonable about the apartment lease, saying I need to keep paying even though I'm moving out." My mother reached across the table to squeeze Rachel's hand sympathetically. "It's just not right. She shouldn't have to deal with this stress on top of a broken heart." I nodded automatically, the appropriate sisterly response, while mentally calculating how long I needed to stay before making my escape. "So," my father continued, cutting into his roast beef with surgical precision, "we've worked it all out. Rachel will move into your place while she gets back on her feet." The casual delivery of this bombshell made it all the more shocking, as if he were announcing a change in dinner plans rather than the invasion of my personal space. My mother smiled brightly, already moving on to logistics. "It makes perfect sense. Your apartment has that spare room you use as an office, and you're always saying how you work late at the office anyway. Rachel just needs a few months to find her own place and recover." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that accompanied these moments, the physical manifestation of boundaries being bulldozed. "I actually use my office," I said, carefully measuring each word. "I've been taking on freelance projects that require a dedicated workspace." My sister rolled her eyes, not even bothering to hide her dismissal. "You can work at the kitchen table. I did that all through college." The fact that her college experience consisted of an art degree funded entirely by our parents, completed in 5.5 years with multiple mental health breaks, went unmentioned. "It's just temporary," my father added with finality, as if that addressed all possible objections. Family helps family. My mother was already on her phone, scrolling through her calendar. "We can help move her things next Saturday. Your building has visitor parking, right?" I watched them planning the dismantling of my personal space, the sanctuary I had created for myself, with the same enthusiasm they once showed planning Rachel's 16th birthday party, while forgetting my 18th. My brother caught my eye across the table and quickly looked away, unwilling to be drawn into a conflict that didn't directly affect him. I recognized the familiar crossroads: speak up and face the collective disapproval of my family, or remain silent and surrender my boundaries once again. This time, however, something shifted inside me. Instead of the anxious need to please that usually accompanied these moments, I felt a calm clarity. "I'll need to check my lease about long-term guests," I said neutrally, neither agreeing nor refusing outright. Of course," my mother waved away my concern. "But that's just formality. They can't stop you from helping your sister." I nodded again, letting them believe my compliance was assured while mentally drafting a completely different plan. The conversation shifted to the logistics of Rachel's move, with no one bothering to ask if I had plans for the weekend they had commandeered or considerations they had overlooked. I offered minimal responses, letting them mistake my quiet for agreement, rather than strategic retreat. As I helped clear the dishes after dessert, mapping out my response in my head, I realized I had reached the point where acquiescence was no longer an option I could live with. The drive home from my parents' house had never felt so liberating, my car becoming the transitional space where the dutiful daughter was replaced by a woman finally ready to take control. Sitting in my car outside my apartment building, I turned off the engine but didn't immediately get out. The familiar post-family dinner emotional hangover was settling in, but this time it came with a new sensation, something between righteous, anger, and absolute clarity. I played the dinner conversation over in my mind, hearing my parents' voices assigning my sister to my home without a single genuine question about my thoughts or feelings. The pattern was so clear now that I could almost laugh at its predictability. My needs always subordinate, my space and time treated as community resources while my siblings were sacrosanct. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my objections in the name of keeping the peace, all the small surrenders that had accumulated into the expectation that I would always bend. "Not this time," I whispered to my reflection in the rear view mirror, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Inside my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and walked through each room, seeing it with fresh eyes, appreciating the sanctuary I had built for myself. The office they so casually suggested I dismantle contained not just my workspace, but the physical representation of dreams I was still building, projects that mattered to me, regardless of whether my family understood their value. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, determination replacing the resignation I usually felt after these family encounters. First, I reviewed my lease agreement, confirming what I already suspected. Subletting without management approval was prohibited, and guests staying longer than 2 weeks needed to be added to the lease with proper background and credit checks. Rather than seeing these as obstacles, I recognized them as the framework for my response. Next, I called my friend Megan, who had witnessed the slow erosion of my boundaries over years of friendship. "They did what?" she exclaimed after I explained the situation. "Oh, hell no, Liv. You can't let this happen again." Her indignation was validating in a way my own emotions rarely were, her outsider perspective confirming that my family's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. "I'm not going to," I said, surprising myself with my conviction. "I just need to figure out how to handle this without causing a complete family meltdown." We talked through options, discarding the direct confrontation approach that had failed in the past. My family had mastered the art of overwhelming opposition through sheer persistence and united guilt-tripping. This situation called for strategy, over confrontation, action over argument. "What if you just weren't there?" Megan suggested. "What if when they show up with Rachel's stuff, you're simply unavailable?" The idea took root immediately. I had vacation days accumulated, and a work conference in Seattle the following month that I could potentially move up. My mind raced with possibilities, not just for avoiding the immediate conflict, but for establishing a precedent that would reshape my family relationships going forward. After ending the call with Megan, I researched tenant rights more thoroughly, taking notes on the legal protection of my occupancy. I contacted my building manager via email, inquiring about the visitor policy and security protocols, framing my questions as general interest rather than specific concern. By midnight, my initial anxiety had transformed into methodical planning. I created a document outlining each step needed to secure my space and my boundaries: schedule adjustment, communication strategy, legal considerations, and contingency plans. I considered who might temporarily occupy my apartment during my absence, someone whose presence would make it impossible for my sister to simply move in. My colleague Derek had recently mentioned needing a place to stay while his condo underwent emergency repairs. He was responsible, professional, and unknown to my family, making him the perfect temporary occupant. The final piece clicked into place when I realized I could create a legitimate short-term sublease for Derek, documenting the arrangement in a way that would stand up to my family's inevitable attempts to circumvent it. As I finally went to bed, exhaustion mingled with a newfound sense of empowerment. For perhaps the first time, I wasn't lying awake rehearsing explanations or apologies for standing up for myself. Instead, I was planning a resolution that would force my family to recognize me as an adult, with rights they could not override, regardless of their expectations or sense of entitlement. The path ahead would be uncomfortable and possibly painful, but as I drifted off to sleep, I knew with absolute certainty that the discomfort of confrontation would be far more bearable than the slow suffocation of surrendering my independence yet again. The week following the family dinner unfolded with methodical precision as I implemented each phase of my plan. Monday morning began with a visit to my building's management office, where I spoke with Tanya, the property manager who had approved my lease application 2 years earlier. "I'm considering having a friend stay while I'm away for work," I explained, careful to frame the situation in neutral terms. "I wanted to make sure I understand all the policies about guests and temporary occupants." Tanya provided the visitor guidelines and sublease paperwork, explaining that any stay longer than 14 days required management approval and a background check for the occupant. I nodded, feigning casual interest while mentally noting how These policies contradicted my family's assumptions. And just to clarify, if someone showed up claiming to be moving in without this paperwork, I asked. Absolutely not permitted, Tanya stated firmly. Security would prevent entry without authorization, and we take that very seriously. It's for everyone's safety and compliance with occupancy laws. Armed with this confirmation, I texted my colleague Derek during lunch, explaining my situation in professional terms while omitting the more dysfunctional family dynamics. I need someone responsible in my apartment while I'm away for 2 weeks. There would be a formal sublease to protect both of us. Would you be interested? Derek's response came within the hour, expressing gratitude for the timing given his ongoing condo repairs. We arranged to meet Wednesday after work to review the arrangement and complete the necessary paperwork. Tuesday evening, I received the first text from Rachel. Mom says I should check with you about what furniture I should bring. I'm thinking my bedroom set would look better in your spare room than whatever you have in there. The presumptuous tone confirmed I was making the right decision. I crafted a deliberately vague response. I'm figuring out some logistics about the apartment situation. Let's touch base next week. This non-committal reply bought time while revealing nothing of my intentions. Wednesday proceeded with purpose as I met with Derek, showing him around my apartment and explaining the temporary arrangement. We completed the sublease agreement, making it official with both signatures and a copy for building management. There's one more thing, I added, slightly uncomfortable but determined. My family doesn't know about this arrangement, and they may show up expecting me to be here. If they do, you're under no obligation to let them in or explain anything beyond the fact that you're the legal occupant during this period. Derek, having dealt with his own family complications following his divorce, nodded with understanding. I can handle that. Just the facts, no drama. That evening, I scheduled my work trip to coincide with my family's planned moving day for Rachel, booking a hotel in a nearby coastal town where I could decompress while maintaining phone access, if absolutely necessary. Thursday morning, I contacted IT at my company to request remote work accommodation for the following week, citing personal circumstances requiring temporary relocation. With my professional obligations secured, I began preparing my apartment, moving important documents and irreplaceable items to a small storage unit I rented for the month. I carefully documented the condition of my apartment, taking photos of each room for comparison upon my return. By Friday, my mother had called twice requesting details about my building's parking access and asking if I could clear out some of those bookshelves to make room for Rachel's essential items. I responded with brief texts about being swamped with work deadlines and promises to work everything out before next weekend. I intentionally created the impression of busy acquiescence while finalizing the details of my counter strategy. Saturday involved setting up a small security camera in my living room, positioned to monitor the entry area, a legal precaution I never imagined needing against my own family. I gave Derek a set of keys, the building access code, and written authorization for building security. That evening, my father texted, "We'll arrive around 11 a.m. Saturday. Have the parking pass ready and clear space in your closet for Rachel's winter clothes." The commanding tone, devoid of any question marks or consideration for my schedule, reinforced my resolve. Sunday morning, I met with Derek for a final walkthrough, confirming he understood the boundaries of the arrangement and providing emergency contact information that notably excluded my immediate family members. As I packed my own bag for my work trip, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm determination. My phone buzzed with a final text from my mother. "Rachel's so excited about her fresh start at your place. This will bring you girls closer together." I left this message unanswered, recognizing it as another attempt to frame their imposition as a gift I should be grateful for. By Sunday evening, everything was in place. I had reclaimed my power not through confrontation, but through careful planning and legitimate exercise of my rights. As I set my phone's notifications to silent mode except for work contacts and Derek, I prepared myself for the inevitable storm that would erupt when my family's expectations collided with the reality I had arranged. The boundaries I had established, on paper, were about to be tested in real life, and for once I felt ready to hold my ground against the tidal wave of family pressure that had always previously swept me away. The days leading up to my family's planned invasion of my apartment brought an increasing stream of one-sided communications that confirmed I had made the right decision. Monday morning began with a text from Rachel. "I'm donating your guest room furniture to make space for my bedroom set. Hope that's cool. No question mark, no real request for permission, just an announcement of decisions already made about my property. I didn't respond immediately, letting the presumption hang, unanswered while I focused on preparing for my temporary absence. By lunchtime, my mother had called twice, leaving voicemails about paint colors Rachel was considering for her room and asking if I could take down the depressing photography from my hallway to make space for Rachel's collection of framed concert posters. The casual dismissal of my carefully curated home decor, pieces I had selected to represent memories and moments important to me, stung in a familiar way but strengthened my resolve. Tuesday evening brought a call from my father, his tone mixing authority with manufactured concern. "Your mother says you haven't been responding to her texts about Rachel's move. Is there a problem we need to discuss?" The question wasn't actually an invitation for honest communication, but rather a thinly veiled directive to fall in line with their plans. "I've been swamped with work," I responded, the half-truth coming easily. "Just finishing up some projects before the weekend." His satisfied grunt told me he had interpreted my answer as compliance, exactly as I had intended. Wednesday escalated. Further, when Rachel sent a group text to our family announcing she had given notice at her apartment and scheduled movers for Saturday. "So excited for sister bonding time," she wrote, tagging me with a series of heart emojis that felt more like claiming territory than expressing affection. My mother responded with enthusiastic planning for a moving day lunch they would bring to my apartment, while my father chimed in with logistics about borrowing his colleague's truck for the larger furniture items. The conversation continued. Without my input, a stream of decisions and arrangements flowing past as if my participation was optional, but my compliance was guaranteed. That evening, I met with Megan for dinner, my last opportunity to see her before I implemented the final phase of my plan. "They're really doing this, aren't they?" she asked, scrolling through the screenshots I showed her of my family's messages. "They have absolutely no doubt you'll just roll over and let them take over your space." I nodded, picking at my food, as the reality of the confrontation ahead settled in my stomach like a stone. I know this is the right thing to do, but I still feel guilty, like I'm being mean or selfish for not helping my sister. Megan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Liv, listen to me. Having boundaries isn't mean. Expecting basic respect isn't selfish. They're the ones being inappropriate here, not you." Her words were a lifeline, reinforcing the perspective I was still struggling to fully embrace. Thursday brought the most presumptuous development yet when my mother forwarded me an email confirmation for a furniture delivery to my address, scheduled for Monday after the move. "Rachel found the perfect desk for her creative projects. Don't worry about the cost, it's our housewarming gift to her." The staggering entitlement of arranging deliveries to my home without consulting me sent a wave of indignation through my body so strong it momentarily overrode my anxiety. I forwarded the confirmation to Derek with a brief note explaining he should refuse any deliveries for Rachel, then blocked my mother's email address from my work account to prevent further distractions. Friday, the day before their planned arrival, my phone began ringing with increasing frequency. My father called 3 times during my morning meetings, each voicemail more irritated than the last. "We need the visitor parking pass code," the first one stated. "Call your mother about the parking situation," demanded the second. By the third, his patience had clearly evaporated. "Olivia, this is ridiculous. Call us back immediately about tomorrow's arrangements." My mother alternated between guilt-inducing messages about Rachel's fragile emotional state following her breakup and passive-aggressive reminders about family obligations. "Your sister would do this for you," she texted, conveniently forgetting the time I needed emergency housing after a pipe burst in my first apartment, and Rachel had claimed her spare room was being used for art storage. By early evening, I had packed my bag for my weekend away and finalized arrangements with Derek, who would move in later that night. I set an out-of-office email response citing a work emergency requiring immediate travel, deliberately vague but official sounding. As I prepared to leave, my phone lit up with a final message from my father. "We'll be at your building at 11 a.m. Sharp. Rachel's entire apartment is packed and ready. Don't make this difficult." The commanding tone, so familiar yet now so clearly inappropriate, cemented my decision. I took one last look around my apartment, noting how peaceful it felt in the quiet before the storm. For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing to prioritize my own boundaries over my family's expectations. And despite the anxiety churning, in my stomach I also felt an unfamiliar sense of self-respect blooming in my chest. As I locked my apartment door and handed the keys to Derek in the hallway, I allowed myself to acknowledge the painful truth. Sometimes establishing healthy boundaries with family feels like a betrayal precisely because they've trained you to betray yourself instead. The real test would come tomorrow when they arrived expecting compliance and found their assumptions shattered against the reality I had carefully constructed. Saturday morning dawned with perfect northwest autumn clarity, the kind of crisp, sunny day that typically energized me. I awoke in my hotel room 30 miles from my apartment, feeling both nervous anticipation and surprising calm about the boundary I was finally enforcing. My phone, which I had kept on Do Not Disturb overnight, showed 5 missed calls from my mother starting at 7:30 a.m., 3 from my father, and a series of increasingly frantic texts from Rachel. "On our way!" The first message announced cheerfully at 9:15. "Dad borrowed Uncle Steve's truck for my dresser. So excited." By 10:30, the tone had shifted. "Where are you? We need the parking pass." At 10:45, "Call Mom now. We're almost there." I sent a brief text to Derek confirming my family was en route and received his calm response. "Got it. Everything's under control here." Then I silenced my phone again and ordered room service breakfast, determined to protect my mental space during what I knew would be a challenging few hours. At precisely 11:03 a.m., my security app pinged with motion detection at my apartment door. Opening the application, I watched the scene unfold in real time. My parents and Rachel stood in the hallway outside my unit, my father pounding on the door with increasing force while my mother repeatedly rang the doorbell. Rachel paced behind them, gesturing animatedly while talking on her phone, presumably trying to reach me. After several minutes of unanswered knocking, my father pulled out his phone and appeared to call building management. I imagined the conversation, with the weekend security staff explaining that no, they could not provide access to an apartment for individuals not on the lease, regardless of family relationship. The security footage continued as my family retreated temporarily, likely heading to the lobby to strategize. 20 minutes later, they returned with a building security officer who appeared to be explaining something that caused my mother to throw her hands up in exasperation. My father's posture stiffened in the way it always did when he encountered resistance to his plans, his authoritative demeanor failing to impress the security professional who was simply doing his job. Just as they seemed ready to leave, the apartment door opened, revealing Derek in casual weekend attire, coffee mug in hand. Even without audio, I could see my family's shock in their body language, the physical recoil of surprise. Derek appeared, perfectly calm, likely explaining his legal occupancy, while my family struggled to process this unexpected development. My mother's hand flew to her chest in her signature gesture of distress, while my father leaned forward aggressively until the security officer stepped between them. Rachel stood frozen, her expression shifting from confusion to outrage as the reality of the situation became clear. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes before the security officer escorted my family back toward the elevator. My father's rigid back and my mother's animated gesturing suggesting heated emotions, barely contained. As they disappeared from the camera's view, I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath while watching the encounter. Within moments, my phone exploded with notifications. Voicemails from my father threatened everything from calling the police to report an unauthorized occupant to coming to my workplace on Monday if I didn't respond immediately. My mother's messages escalated from confusion to accusation. "How could you do this to your sister? We've raised you better than this." Rachel's texts were less restrained, a stream of all-caps invective questioning my character, loyalty, and basic human decency. I forwarded the most concerning messages to my friend Megan, who had offered to monitor the situation in case legal intervention became necessary. "Your family is melting down," she texted back after reviewing them. "But you're completely within your rights. Stay strong." Around 1 p.m., Derek called to give me a first-hand account of the confrontation. "Your father tried to insist they had your permission to enter," he explained. "When I showed them the sublease agreement, he claimed it must be fraudulent." The security guy had to remind him that attempting unauthorized entry could result in police involvement. He chuckled lightly. They left when your dad realized he was creating a scene in front of your neighbors. Your mom said they would address this betrayal directly with you. I thanked him for handling the situation so professionally and asked if he felt comfortable continuing with our arrangement given the conflict. Absolutely, he assured me. Your family's drama doesn't change our agreement. Your home is secure. By early evening, the initial barrage of calls and texts had slowed, replaced by a more strategic approach. My aunt called, clearly enlisted as a mediator, her voice gentle with practiced concern. Everyone's worried about you, Olivia. This isn't, like you, shutting out your family when they need you. I let her voicemail play to completion, but didn't return the call, recognizing the familiar pattern of using extended family to apply pressure when direct methods failed. My father's final message of the day came at 10:30 p.m., his voice deliberately controlled but underlined with anger. Your mother is distraught. Rachel has nowhere to go. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. This childish stunt ends now. Call us in the morning to arrange access to your apartment. As I prepared for bed in my quiet hotel room, I felt an unexpected sense of peace despite the day's chaos. For the first time, I had set a boundary and held it firm against the tidal wave of family pressure. The guilt and anxiety were still present, familiar companions after years of emotional conditioning, but alongside them was something new and fragile. Pride in my own strength and the certainty that I deserved the basic respect of being consulted about my own living space. Tomorrow would bring more confrontation as my family adjusted to this new reality, but tonight I allowed myself to recognize a simple truth. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for both yourself and others is to stop participating in unhealthy patterns, even when, especially when, that disruption causes discomfort. The path to healthier relationships begins with the courage to say no when saying yes would require the sacrifice of your self-respect. Sunday morning arrived with the strange quietness that follows upheaval, like the stillness after a thunderstorm. I checked my security feed first thing, relieved to see no unexpected visitors had attempted to return to my apartment overnight. My phone showed fewer messages than I expected, suggesting my family might be regrouping to develop a new strategy. The first text came from Rachel at 7:15 a.m., her tone dramatically different from yesterday's rage. I don't understand why you're doing this to me. I have nowhere to go. Is this because of that time I borrowed your sweater in high school and stretched it out? I said I was sorry for that. The attempt to minimize the situation by referencing a trivial past conflict rather than acknowledging the genuine boundary violation in the present was so characteristic of our family dynamics that I almost laughed despite the tension. I didn't respond, recognizing the message as the first move in the familiar dance of deflection and guilt manipulation. By mid-morning, my mother had shifted from anger to bargaining, her voicemail suggesting compromises that still fundamentally disregarded my autonomy. Maybe Rachel could just stay for 2 weeks while she finds another place? We could pay you a little rent if that's what this is about. Family helps family, Olivia. The implication that my boundary was motivated by financial interest rather than basic respect for my space and independence revealed how deeply she misunderstood my position. My father's communication style evolved as well, moving from commands to calculated reason. I understand you feel we should have discussed this more thoroughly. That's fair. Let's sit down like adults and work out a solution that helps your sister while respecting your concerns. His measured tone couldn't disguise the underlying assumption that the end result would still be Rachel moving into my apartment, just with the veneer of my consent added to legitimize the arrangement. Around noon, I received an unexpected text from my brother Ethan, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the conflict. Mom and Dad are freaking out. Rachel's staying at their place and complaining nonstop. Not sure what happened exactly, but whatever you did to stand up to them, respect. His message was the first acknowledgement from any family member that my resistance might be justified, and it provided a small but significant counterbalance to the overwhelming pressure from the rest of the family. Derek updated me throughout the day, reporting that building security had increased patrols of my floor after my family's confrontational behavior raised concerns. Your father called the management office this morning, he informed me. The weekend manager told me he demanded to speak to someone about fraudulent sublease documentation, but was informed all your paperwork was properly filed and legally binding. The failed attempt to override my arrangements through building management confirmed my decision to handle this situation through official channels rather than emotional appeals had been the right approach. By Sunday evening, extended family members began weighing in, clearly having received a carefully edited version of events. My grandmother called to express her disappointment that I wouldn't help poor Rachel during her time of need. My mother's sister emailed a lengthy message about the importance of sibling bonds and how I would regret this selfishness when I was older and needed family support. I archived these messages without responding, recognizing them as the next phase in the escalation pattern, the widening of the conflict to include allies who would apply additional pressure. Monday morning brought practical concerns as my father sent a terse message about Rachel's furniture, which was apparently sitting in a rented moving truck accruing daily fees. This situation is costing us money now. What do you suggest we do? With your sister's belongings? The question was the closest thing to an acknowledgement that their original plan had failed, and they were being forced to consider alternatives. I didn't respond immediately, letting the reality of consequences for their presumptuous actions settle in without my intervention. By Monday afternoon, my mother had reverted to emotional appeals, sending a photo of Rachel looking forlorn surrounded by boxes in my parents' living room. "This is what your stubbornness has caused," the caption read, a transparent attempt to transfer responsibility for their failed plan onto me. I muted the conversation and spent the evening researching family therapists in our area, recognizing that if any healthy relationship was to be salvaged from this situation, professional guidance would be essential. Tuesday brought the first sign of genuine recalibration as my father's tone shifted from demanding to pragmatic. "We're looking at apartment listings for Rachel. Let us know when you're ready to discuss what happened." The brief message contained no apology or acknowledgement of overstepping, but the pivot to finding alternative housing for my sister represented the first tangible evidence that my boundary was being recognized, if not yet respected. That evening, I crafted a careful response, my first direct communication since the confrontation. "I'm glad you're helping Rachel find her own place. I'll be back in town Friday and am willing to meet and talk on Saturday afternoon." The message was intentionally neutral, offering an opportunity for discussion without apology for my actions or emotional engagement with their accusations. Wednesday and Thursday passed with minimal contact, suggesting my family was processing the situation in their own way. Rachel sent one message asking if I could store just a few boxes in my apartment until she found a place, which I politely declined, maintaining the boundary I had established. By Friday morning, as I checked out of my hotel, I felt ready to re-engage with my family from a position of newfound strength. The past week had been challenging but transformative, forcing all of us to confront patterns of interaction that had gone unquestioned for decades. As I drove back toward the city, I recognized that the upcoming conversation would be difficult but necessary, the first step in either rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms or accepting that some distance might be required to maintain my hard-won independence. Either way, I was approaching the situation as a full adult with legitimate rights and boundaries, not as the perpetual accommodating daughter whose needs always came last. That shift in perspective, more than any practical outcome, represented the true victory in this painful but necessary confrontation with family dynamics that should have been challenged long ago. Saturday afternoon arrived with golden autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of the neutral territory I had selected for our family meeting, a quiet coffee shop equidistant from my apartment and my parents' house. I arrived 15 minutes early, deliberately choosing a corner table with good visibility of the entrance and enough privacy for our conversation. Ordering a cappuccino provided a moment to steady my nerves and review the key points I had prepared, determined to remain calm and clear, regardless of how my family approached the discussion. My mother arrived first, 5 minutes early as was her habit, her expression carefully composed but her rapid blinking betraying her nervousness. She moved to hug me, hesitating when I offered a hand instead, the small gesture establishing new boundaries from the outset. My father and Rachel arrived together moments later, my father's face set in the stern expression he adopted when preparing for difficult negotiations, Rachel's eyes red-rimmed from either tears or lack of sleep. An awkward silence fell as they settled into their seats, the familiar family dynamic temporarily disrupted by the unprecedented situation. My father cleared his throat, assuming his usual role as conversation director. Well, Olivia, I think you owe us all an explanation for your behavior last weekend. The framing was predictable, positioning me as the transgressor despite their actions, and I recognized it as the opening gambit it was. Actually, I replied, keeping my voice deliberately. I think we need to discuss why you all made plans for my apartment without consulting me first. My directness clearly surprised them, my mother's eyebrows rising as my father's mouth tightened at the corners. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly very interested in stirring her untouched coffee. We were trying to help your sister? My mother began, her voice sliding into the gentle remonstrance that had diffused countless family conflicts in the past. You have that extra room just sitting there while Rachel needed a place to stay. Family helps family. The familiar refrain hung in the air between us, a maxim I had heard countless times when sacrifices were expected of me, but rarely when I needed support. I understand Rachel needed help, I acknowledged, but deciding she would move into my home without even asking me first wasn't help. It was an invasion of my space and disregard for my autonomy. My father leaned forward, his patience visibly thinning. This melodramatic terminology isn't helpful, Olivia. Invasion? Autonomy? We're talking about your sister needing temporary housing, not some philosophical debate about personal boundaries. The dismissal of my concerns as melodrama was another familiar tactic, one that had effectively silenced me in past conflicts. This time, however, I had anticipated the move and prepared my response. It is about boundaries, Dad. Healthy ones. Would you have made these arrangements for Rachel to move into Ethan's apartment without asking him first? The question landed, with visible impact, my father sitting back slightly as he considered. My mother jumped in quickly. That's different. Ethan's situation is different. The vague justification highlighted the double standard I had lived with for years, making it impossible to ignore. Different how? I pressed gently. Because you respect his space and decisions in a way you don't respect mine? Rachel finally spoke, her voice wavering between defensiveness and genuine confusion. I didn't know they hadn't talked to you about it first. They told me you were fine with the arrangement. Her revelation shifted something in the conversation, suggesting my parents had misled not just me, but also my sister about the level of communication that had occurred. My mother flushed slightly, her gaze dropping to her coffee cup. We were going to discuss the details with you, but we knew you'd be agreeable once you understood Rachel's situation. The presumption inherent in her statement hung in the air, impossible to ignore. That's exactly the problem, I said quietly. You didn't talk to me because you assumed I'd say yes regardless of my own needs or circumstances. You treated my home as community property rather than my personal space. My father started to respond, but paused, seemingly processing my words with unexpected consideration. The momentary silence stretched until he finally spoke, his tone notably less combative. Perhaps we should have approached this differently. Your living situation is your own business, and we overstepped. The acknowledgement, however reluctant, was more than I had honestly expected, and I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen slightly. My mother's expression remained troubled, her innate desire for family harmony clearly battling with the disruption to established patterns. We just want what's best for both our girls, she said, reaching toward me again. You've always been so independent, we sometimes forget to check if you need your space. The qualifier sometimes understated decades of boundary violations, but I recognized the statement as the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive in this initial conversation. Rachel looked between our parents, then directly at me, her expression more genuine than I had seen in years. I'm sorry, Liv. I should have called you directly instead of just assuming everything was arranged. That was really inconsiderate. Her apology, unqualified and straightforward, surprised me most of all. Thank you for saying that, I replied sincerely. I would have been happy to help you find solutions if I'd been approached respectfully. The conversation shifted then, moving from accusation to tentative problem-solving. My father mentioned several apartments they had found for Rachel, more affordable than she had initially wanted, but within her budget with some parental assistance. My mother suggested a family gathering to help Rachel move once she secured a place, carefully adding, "If everyone's available," with a meaningful glance at me. As the tension gradually eased, I introduced my final prepared point, the one I had been most nervous about addressing. Going forward, I need certain boundaries respected, direct communication rather than assumptions, consulting me about decisions that affect my life before they're made, and respecting my right to say no without being made to feel selfish or difficult. My father nodded slowly, the businessman in him recognizing reasonable terms, even if the father in him struggled with the changing dynamic. Fair enough. We'll try to be more mindful. My mother reached across the table, not to touch me, but to place her hand near mine, a gesture of connection without presumption. We love you, Olivia. Sometimes we get caught up in managing everything and forget that you're an adult with your own life now. As we prepared to leave, arrangements tentatively made for helping Rachel with apartment viewings the following weekend, I felt both exhausted and cautiously optimistic. The conversation hadn't solved everything. Decades of family patterns couldn't be restructured in a single coffee shop meeting, but it had established a precedent for more respectful interaction that I was determined to maintain going forward. Rachel hung back as our parents headed to their car, catching my arm gently. "I really am sorry," she said, her voice lower and more sincere than the performance contrition she had often deployed in family conflicts. "And I'm kind of impressed, actually. I've never seen anyone stand up to Mom and Dad like that." Her acknowledgement of the difficulty and significance of what I had done provided unexpected validation. It wasn't easy, I admitted, but it was necessary for all of us. As I watched them drive away, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Not because all problems were solved, but because I had finally found my voice in the family conversation that had excluded it for so long. Returning to my apartment after Derek's sublease ended felt like coming home to a space that was truly mine in a way it hadn't been before. The physical surroundings were unchanged, every piece of furniture and decoration exactly where I had left them. But something fundamental had shifted in my relationship to this sanctuary I had created for myself. Standing in my living room that first evening alone, I ran my hand along the bookshelf my father had so casually suggested clearing. For Rachel's belongings, appreciating how each object represented choices I had made for myself, rather than accommodations for others' expectations. The week following our coffee shop conversation brought subtle but significant changes in my family's communication patterns. My mother called rather than texted about family matters, her carefully worded questions actually framed as requests, rather than assumptions. "We're helping Rachel look at apartments on Saturday if you'd like to join us," she offered, the tentative phrasing acknowledging my right to decline without judgment. My father's communication remained more distant, but noticeably more respectful. His habitual directives replaced by informational updates that required no response. Rachel surprised me most, reaching out to suggest lunch, just us sisters, with an openness I hadn't experienced with her since childhood. Our meal together revealed aspects of her perspective I had never considered, including her own struggles with our parents' expectations, and her genuine belief that I had willingly agreed to share my apartment. "They always made it sound like you were happy to help, eager even," she explained, picking at her salad. "I never questioned it because it fit the story they always told about you being the responsible, accommodating one." Her words illuminated how our parents had shaped our perception of each other, casting us in complementary roles that prevented genuine connection. "I'm trying to be more independent," she admitted. "Seeing you stand your ground made me realize how much I've let them handle everything in my life." The conversation marked the beginning of a more authentic relationship between us, one based on direct communication rather than roles assigned by our parents. The process of rebuilding family dynamics on healthier terms wasn't without setbacks. My mother occasionally slipped into old patterns, making comments about how my new attitude was making family planning more complicated. My father sometimes responded to my boundaries with cool distance, his discomfort with the changed power dynamic evident in his reluctance to engage directly. Family dinner the following month was tense at moments. The established roles we had, all played for decades, not easily abandoned despite conscious efforts. Yet amid these challenges, I found my own confidence growing. Each time I politely but firmly maintained a boundary, the paralyzing guilt that had previously accompanied any self-advocacy diminished slightly. When my mother called asking me to host Thanksgiving despite my earlier refusal, I was able to decline without the hours of anxious justification that would once have followed such a conversation. "That doesn't work for me this year," I stated, simply offering to bring side dishes to whoever did host but remaining firm in my decision. The brief silence before her acceptance of my answer felt like victory, small but significant. Rachel found an apartment in early December, a modest one-bedroom closer to her workplace than she would have previously considered. I helped her move in, our collaboration lacking the tension that had characterized so many of our past interactions. As we arranged her furniture, she confided that she had started therapy, partly inspired by my example of setting boundaries. "I need to figure out who I am outside of being the artistic, emotional daughter who always needs rescuing," she explained as we assembled her bookshelf. "I want to be someone who can handle her own life." Her vulnerability in that moment created a bridge between us stronger than any we had built in childhood, founded on mutual respect rather than assigned family roles. The holiday season brought the ultimate test of our family's evolving dynamic when we gathered at my parents' house for Christmas dinner. My mother had called ahead to ask what dish I could contribute rather than simply assigning one, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of my adult autonomy. My father greeted me with a warmth that had been absent since our confrontation, his gradual acceptance of the new family balance evident in his genuine questions about my work and plans for the new year. As we exchanged gifts and shared stories, I noticed subtle shifts in everyone's behavior. My parents consulting each other rather than making unilateral decisions, Rachel gently declining my mother's unsolicited career advice, my own comfort, in expressing opinions that diverged from family consensus. The evening wasn't perfect, old patterns occasionally emerging before being consciously redirected, but it represented genuine progress toward healthier family relationships. Driving home that night, I reflected on the journey of the past few months, from the family dinner where my parents had assigned my sister to my apartment, to this holiday gathering where boundaries were beginning to be acknowledged, if not yet fully respected. The process of healing family relationships distorted by years of unhealthy dynamics would be ongoing, requiring continued vigilance and occasional reinforcement of boundaries. Yet the fundamental shift had occurred, not just in how my family treated me, but in how I viewed myself in relation to them. I had discovered that standing up for myself didn't have to mean cutting ties or constant conflict, but rather creating space for more authentic connection based on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles and unexamined expectations. As I unlocked my apartment door, returning to the space I had fought to protect, I felt grateful not just for these walls and this sanctuary, but for the stronger sense of self I had discovered within them. The most valuable lesson from this painful family confrontation wasn't about property rights or living arrangements, but about the fundamental truth that healthy relationships require both love and boundaries, both care and respect. By finally saying no to a boundary violation I would once have silently accepted, I had opened the possibility of saying yes to a more genuine connection with my family, one built on who we truly were rather than who we were expected to be. Have you ever had to stand up to your family to protect your boundaries? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest people to set boundaries with are the ones we love most, but as I learned, it's often the healthiest thing we can do for ourselves and our relationships. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you want more stories about navigating complex family dynamics and personal growth. Remember, setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's essential for building authentic relationships that can truly stand the test of time.